as he said, this is our Q&A session, and we really wanted to do something like this because we know how strongly people feel about the Brexit issue and that people do want to put questions. And we've chosen a theme to sort of give ourselves a bit of guidance. The theme you may have seen already is Fighting for Sovereignty, the Next Generation. And you'll see that we have quite a young lineup of people here on the panel. So the theme is kind of twofold, really. Firstly, and fairly obviously, it's to discuss young people and their relationship with Brexit, which Ben has already raised some quite important points and may well go into in more detail depending on the questions that are asked. But also looking at the future of Brexit in long-term perspective. So for the past 3 years, we've really been bogged down in the details of just how can we get out of the EU. And it's really easy to sort of lose the bigger picture. So the second aspect is sort of the long-term future of Brexit and how it will affect the generations here on the panel. Are we going to have to keep fighting for Brexit? You know, it's one thing getting out. How long are we going to have to keep fighting for to make sure it's maintained? So I'll just introduce the panel. So on my far left, David Banks. Thank you for your excellent talk earlier, David. So David, as you know, is a researcher at Veterans for Britain who's helped expose the UK's slide into the EU Defence Union since 2016. And on my near left, Gerard Lyons. Gerard did his undergrad degree at Cambridge, studying theology and the philosophy of religion. And more importantly, he was also the president of the Cambridge Brexit campaign. And he's now doing his master's at UCL here in London on international public policy. And on my far right, Ben Aston needs no introduction. Runs Levers of Dorset. And on my near right is Laura Beerson-Nielsen. Laura Beera-Nielsen. I've been practicing that all day and it hasn't paid off. So Laura is studying history and international relations at King's College London, and she is also works as Director of Policy and Research at Labour Leave. So a big welcome to all of our panellists. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'm going to ask a quick question just to get us started off, and then we'll open the to questions from the floor. So I'd just like us to address this issue quite directly of the generation gap in Brexit. There's been a lot of polls done. Obviously, polls aren't always the most trustworthy, but the results are fairly consistent that if you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, only a quarter of them are saying that they actually voted for Brexit. So how can we explain this? Why is it that Brexit is much less popular among young people than among the older generations? Gerard, I'll come to you first.
Hi, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me and the kind introduction, and to follow up some incredible speeches earlier. So as you said, I ran the Cambridge Brexit campaign, and I'd often joke that it wasn't the biggest aphrodisiac amongst the student body. And that was mainly because of how Brexit was perceived, and how Ben spoke in his last speech is the crux of the issue. My perception was that Leave was very much seen in the light of a regressive Little Englander trying to harken back to the days of Royal Britannia and sense of empire and colonialism. And it was really hard to tackle that perception against the progressive, you can live, laugh, love in 28 countries that the Remain campaign was propagating. And so whilst, as Ben alluded to, you could quiz these people on the actual intricacies of the European Union, how it's not the most democratic, it's big business, it's very bureaucratic, and you'd actually get good feedback from that because you're getting people to engage. People would never get past the perceptions or the skin depth. They just look at the characters that are on the television or on the radio. They'd see the Nigel Farages, the Jacob Rees-Moggs, the Boris Johnsons, who, all incredible individuals in their ways. but people would switch off. And I think you have to rebrand what it means to be Brexit. It isn't this sense of Little Englander. It's a sense of, global, you're ridding yourself from this slow growth region that's fundamentally anti-democratic. And until that sort of difference between the reality and the perception is bridged, I think you're always going to be struggling to engage young people in what it means to be a Brexiteer.
Okay, Laura, I'll come to you now, another student. So what's your take on young people and Brexit?
So thank you for having me. I would follow on from that. I mean, from the perspective of Labour Leave, there was a disheartening moment during the referendum where we realised that Jeremy Corbyn was not going to stand by his long-standing Eurosceptic views. And I think from the perspective of a young person who most of the peers I look around at are left-leaning, they were really turned off by the lack of leadership that Jeremy Corbyn and other Labour Brexiteers that have been, I've just finished my dissertation on Labour Euroscepticism, the history of it. And I mean, the tradition is within the left of Euroscepticism, and that's so often forgotten. And I think it's really important that when we talk about rebranding, we rebrand it as more, like you were saying, more than Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is a proportion of the population. I'm not disregarding that, but it's important to look beyond that. And from the left-wing perspective, we need to start putting forward a socialist vision of why the EU is not good for us and why the EU, if, regardless of what our own views are, if a country votes for a government which supports state aid or nationalisation, this isn't possible in the EU or the customs union or any of these really close alignment with any form of European institutions. And that hasn't been put forward. And that, to be fair, is partly a failure of the Labour leadership. And I think actually if Jeremy Corbyn had put forward a much more positive view of Brexit and a global internationalist vision, I think we would be in a very different position today. And I think young people would seriously have considered voting for Brexit and seriously understood the arguments a lot more, because young people flocked to Jeremy Corbyn when he became leader, and they were looking for vision on this fundamental issue, and that was not given, sadly.
Yeah.
Okay, David, rebranding needed?
Yes, I think so. There needs to be a different narrative that's communicated to young people, I think, because if young people were to be encouraged to consider their prospects for getting university places, jobs, homes, which are all subject to the outcome of EU membership, then they would perhaps understand the context of EU membership far closer to their own life. And I think that's not they're being encouraged to think of different things. They're encouraged to think of the EU as kind of like a warm hug, as Gerard was saying. However, I think that there is a positive in our observation of the whole generational shift. And that goes like this. When I was 18, I didn't really understand the European Union, but I thought I liked it. And I had this blue jumper. It was before the days they were known as hoodies, but it had a hood. And I took it to my mum and I asked her to sew 12 golden stars on the back, because I kind of liked the look of the EU flag, and I thought I liked what it was. Oh, it's the EU. It's the next big thing. It's so youth and interesting. It's amazing. And my mum duly obliged, and the very next day, I had this EU jumper, probably the first one I ever made. And looking back now, I think, what was I thinking? But I think other people who are of that age, I'm not going to patronise, but there will be people who, like me, aged 18, didn't know the full story. And so we have, as our advantage, the prospect that people are going to go through a kind of a bit of a learning curve, and we can help to influence that. If and when we get out of the EU, there will be a kind of an incumbency advantage where the default will be that young people will see themselves as British rather than EU citizens, and that in itself will have a bit of a magnetic effect upon the way that people view the landscape. And it'll be our job to try and communicate the advantages of nationhood and how the complete picture from the individual to Parliament to describing the whole democratic chain stacks up for people, including young people. And if that's communicated instead of this warm hug, then that will be to our advantage.
Okay, thank you. Jared, you just wanted to add something to that?
Yes, I was just going to add on to what Laura was mentioning. I was watching Newsnight a few weeks ago, and Polly Timeby, unchallenged, said how Brexit was a sort of right-wing Tory party invention, and it was left unchallenged. And Laura's completely right that you have to look at sort of the speech of Gates Gill, Peter Shaw, amongst others, Ben, to realise that, you know, a lot of the Euroscepticism is very much cross-partisan. It doesn't define one political party. And given, you know, young people don't really affiliate particularly with any political party at the moment, we've got to try and cultivate Brexit as representing something that's greater than, you know, the tribal politics that has defined much of discourse. So.
Okay, so Ben, you touched on this quite a lot in your talk, actually, about the sort of needing to rebrand the values that we express through Brexit. So do you think that's the whole story when it comes to explaining this age discrepancy in Brexit?
All right. So yeah, that's a very difficult question. There's an element of, you know, when you're a young person, you like socialism, and there's a correlation as you age. You become, when you have a family and you start to pay taxes, you realise that actually maybe that's not quite such a good idea. And I think there's probably an element of that. There's a learning experience as people get older, but there are, as I said in my speech, there are some narratives you can construct to say that actually those would be counteracted in some ways. And I think that we need to challenge those, and we need to get into the universities, and we need to engage young people. And Nigel Farage is not going to engage young people. I actually think it's a bit of a shame in some ways that Farage is leading the Brexit party. I think that you know, he would obviously have to have a role in any future Eurosceptic movement, just by virtue of who he is. But you know, if you're gonna really win the debate, you need to actually have people who are going to connect with people of different demographics. As was said earlier, I think there's a massive factual deficit. I mean, people like to say that Leave voters were low information voters, right? We're uninformed Leavers. I've spoken to hundreds of Remainers because I have a deep fascination in Brexit, and I like to put myself through torture, and almost none of them understand the European Union, and that's just an observable fact.
Okay, so we'll go to the floor now. The gentleman at the back with the dark shirt.
Okay, actually, can I pull rank and ask a question? When you do speak to young people, I'm old, they do say about future employment. And you tell them about the unemployment in Greece and Portugal, and they know nothing about that unemployment. And also, one last question is, I understand there's quite a bit more propaganda in schools. Are they falling foul of propaganda?
Who'd like to take that? Has anyone experienced propaganda in schools?
I mean, I can take it on behalf of university. I go to King's College, and there is no doubt that I wouldn't call it propaganda. What I'd call it is probably a bias. There is no doubt that there is a very strong bias against Brexiteers in every single course I took this year, and I do international relations and history. So, you know, touches on Brexit, but shouldn't be primarily on it. Every single lecture, without fail, mentioned Brexit, and they did it in a derogatory way. Whether it was a snide comment towards somebody like Nigel Farage or somebody else, which had nothing to do with the course, but there would always be a mention. And when I actually challenge those views, you are viewed as, you know, a Nazi, a fascist, and then when I put forward the view, actually, no, I work for Labour Leave, it's kind of a contradiction, don't you think? And they can't fathom it. They can't fathom that there would be somebody who's Labour and also a Brexiteer. And when I try and put forward the view that 5 million Labour voters voted to leave, it's out of their comprehension, and they think of them as just sort of, they must just be the thick working classes from up north who have nothing to do with us, you know. And yeah. I joke, but these kinds of things are actually said to me. So no, I do agree with you, but I would say that the use of the word propaganda, I think if we throw that around, people will get turned off when we say those kinds of phrases. I think there probably is a bias, and it's just about challenging it. It's scary to put your head above the parapet, I would say that, but you know, more and more young people are trying to do it, and sadly we're shot down quite a lot, is what I'd say.
Okay, Jared, do you want to tell us?
Yes, referring to the first part of the question about employment figures, the gentleman earlier in his speech spoke about how, you know, if people want to go to work, they tend to go not to the European Union, but countries outside of it, Australia, USA, examples. People from the UK tend to go to the EU, tend to be older. So this perception that, you know, young people rely on the European market, freedom of movement for employment is probably slightly overplayed. And also to corroborate what Laura was saying, our universities, a lot of these things are fundamentally fashionable, and if there's a sort of status quo bias to be Eurosceptic, or you know, if you're a Europhile that's positive, then people tend to fall in line. And so part of the issue is sort of reaching a critical mass whereby you're not afraid to openly advocate Brexit, and you're not going to be sort of shot down or perceived to also have other views associated with you. You know, I think often people use Brexit as sort of Brexit as an insult, a derogatory term to encompass a lot more than just Euroscepticism. But unfortunately, you know, being an imperialist, yeah, you know, maybe homophobic, racist, etc., etc. And yeah, it really does throw with people's perceptions, because everyone wants to pigeonhole things. They want to be very black and white. So if you are able to get someone to speak at university who's, you know, a big female character in business who's pro-Brexit, you do see students really trying to compute how that works in their simple binaries.
Challenging the stereotypes.
Okay, let's go to the gentleman who I promised a question, the guy in black shirt.
One thing.
No.
Which one?
Let the poor guy ask his question.
So I guess that quite a few of you have done canvassing. As you know, knocking on a door, 8 out of 10 people don't want to change their minds. They're never really going to change their minds. Maybe over the course of a few decades, you could slowly change their minds. It's something that I've done quite a lot of. Now, I'm a teaching assistant, and it's an industry that I will not be staying in. I'm learning to code right now because it is somewhere utterly inhospitable for anyone with my views. If you disagree or dissent from the mainstream, people can quote communist propaganda and stuff, and you turn around and say, oh, well, I disagree with that. Suddenly you are causing hassle, you're causing trouble, and they'll get rid of you. They will just sack you. They will manipulate everything to get rid of you, to push you out. There is an agenda, and there's a selection bias in the teachers who are teaching your children and your grandchildren. You are leaving your children and your grandchildren with a bunch of people you don't know for 6 hours a day, for 5 days a week. And you expect them to turn out like you? The idea that you send your child to a school and the school raises the child is fundamentally new. That's only been around for 100 years. And even so, secondary schools, they weren't around for university for quite a while. It's not normal, and there is systematic indoctrination going on. You can see it. Now, it's very clear. If we do manage to leave, we need to transition to a new form of education, a voucher-based system. So you, as a parent, can go and choose the school. If you want to pay extra for a slightly better school, you can choose that. Because wherever there is state provision, there is a selection bias in the people who staff the schools and educate your children. Your children are brought up by teachers.
So the question, I guess, is how do we address this, which is a very difficult question. But does anyone on the panel have any thoughts on how we begin to address this?
I've got one thought.
Okay, go for it, David.
Brexit, because it's infiltrated. Everything you say, there's an infiltration of the EU.
My wife's a teacher, and she's told me some anecdotes very similar to that. And I think one way of addressing it, actually, is to treat politics in state education, whether it's schools or universities, in the way that the armed forces does, which is to ban it from the staff discourse. The armed forces understands that it is counterproductive, it's divisive and difficult. Hence, some soldiers have just been sacked. I think it was quite unfair the way they were treated, but there are rules that say that soldiers and any other personnel are not allowed to get into political debates while they're on duty. It should be the same. It would be so much better if it were the same, that what they will teachers and university lecturers would try to claim is that it's an essential part of their teaching. Well, when it's an essential part, that's fine, but then it should be done according to a very strict code. I would totally concur that things have gone far too far. The staff room debates bleed into the classroom.
I suppose I might just say that one way to possibly solve the problem would be to introduce proper competition in terms of schools. I know almost nothing about the school system, but if there's sufficient knowledge, if parents are sufficiently knowledgeable about the schools before they send their kids to them, then they can choose the ones that are aligned with their views or the ones that are politically neutral. I don't know. But I can give you an anecdote of the kind of scale of the problem. As I mentioned in my talk, I'm trying to set up actually maybe I didn't mention it, but I'm trying to set up a debate at Bournemouth University with some students and about Brexit. And I contacted the Students' Union president, and as soon as he knew I was a Leaver, that was the end of the discussion. And it's not an active end, it's just a passive end. They stop communicating with you. The adults, if you will, at the university, head of community partnerships or some strange title, she'll continue to communicate with you. She'll get back to you late if you're a Leaver, but she'll use weasel words to basically be as unhelpful as possible if you're a Leaver. Whereas if you're a Remainer, I have this very interesting case study where I've got myself and a friend of mine who's a Remainer. She knew who we both were. We were talking about the same debate because we were both taking part in it. I'd found him, and the emails were essentially about the same thing to the same person, and the response to me was all closed, shut down, end of discussion, sorry, I don't know. To him, there was a numbered list of what you need to do. So that's it.
Okay, before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to add my own experience, because there are some examples of good practice as well. And I do think it's important that we recognise that, as well as calling out the examples of bad practice that we've heard from people like Laura. I attended a debate at the University of Manchester recently. I was invited on behalf of Briefings for Brexit, which is the website representing pro-Brexit academics. And it was brilliant. It was impartial in as much there was balance on the panel. There was 2 Leavers and 2 Remainers, which you would never see on the BBC or anywhere else. The questions from the students were very thought through, very objective in terms of they were politics students, so they were really trying to analyse. And even when they were clearly Remainers, they were asking very genuine, open questions rather than it being aggressive. So I think we should recognise those examples of good practice and encourage more of them, as well as calling out the examples of bad practice and bringing them to light. Okay, lady right in the front row with a question.
When I was at school a long, long time ago, we had debates in my secondary school, and you had someone pro and someone against, and then we often had a vote. But there was no anger. Today there's all this anger. And I believe that in some universities you can't, I think you were saying that, you can't have debates on certain subjects. And it's absolutely ridiculous. If we could have debates like the one you were talking about, it would be really good, and people could actually listen. But it's like you can't. You have to be on the right side of the debate, and that's a problem.
Okay, so is that something you guys are picking up on, the anger in debates? So what was your experience?
Yes, there's sort of a perception that, you know, free speech is great as long as I agree with what you're saying. And that sort of maxim sort of characterises a lot of debates at universities. And I think universities more broadly are having very strong discussions about freedom of speech and concepts of being offended. And sort of this is where you sort of veer into topics like safe spaces. So I don't want to, you know, veer off tangent too much, but certain issues are very divisive. And whilst previously, as you were saying, you could still have these debates of individuals, but sort of they transcend the individual's character. You know, I might disagree with you, but I can still enjoy your company as a person. You sort of forget it. That's sort of occurring less and less. And it's sort of, as I touched upon earlier, people associate certain views with also other views. And so people often come to very quick character judgments based on whether or not you voted Brexit, or, you know, if you hold X or Y opinion. And I think that is a danger, that we're sort of suffering into groupthink in that way.
Okay, so Laura, you touched on you'd experienced a lot of anger from the left.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that although I agree, debates like this are, like you were talking about, are excellent, and they're really helpful. My biggest fear is that in universities, it's not about the big debates where it's all one side or all the other. It's the drip feeding of sort of a drip feeding of ideas of, like I was saying, whatever the subject, you could be talking about, you know, communist China, or you could be talking about, you know, post-colonial Africa, whatever you're talking about, there will always be a derogatory remark to a side, a view which they don't agree with. And even if this is, you know, not a, you know, we have sort of debates at university and then we also have like lectures, this can just be a lecture where it's purely supposed to be informative, purely supposed to tell you what's going on, here are the facts, this is what happened. But even with that, there's always an overtone of those kinds of views. And, you know, if you mention that you're doing a course on, first year I did a course on British Empire, and suddenly somebody found out I voted for Brexit, and oh my God, it was like, well, that's perfect for you, isn't it? It was like, oh my God, you know, sorry, no, I didn't realise it wasn't, you know, I'm not going to this course on the basis of believing in the British Empire. I'm here because I want to learn about it, like you guys do. So there is a view, like you're talking about, in regards to the brand of Brexit, and I think for me, it's the drip feeding that's the problem, and the view that to be good, and, you know, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, you know, Neil Kinnock, in his sort of, you know, road to Damascus period in the 80s towards, you know, Europhilia, he said very clearly, you know, being pro-EU or pro-EEC equals modernisation, and, you know, modernity is the EEC. It was this sort of perfect conception of being, you know, in their 1990 policy review, it literally was to be modern was to be part of the EEC. And I think that's where we need to change that conception, that being modern and being young and, you know, forward-thinking and integrationist and, you know, loving people from different parts of the world, that must be part of the European Union.
Go from the gentleman in the black jacket at the back.
I'd like to ask Laura and Jared, what's young people's perception of sovereignty? Sovereignty's been the underlying issue throughout this afternoon. What do people at universities, and you're at King's and UCL, which are both left of centre universities, shall we say, but what do young people think about the sovereignty issue in particular?
Well, generalise that.
I mean,
go on, Jared.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's always important not to talk about young people in one homogenous voice, but I guess we can talk about majorities. I think young people, more so than older generations, probably believe in this idea that we're global citizens or a part of a global world. And, you know, whilst, you know, you can have international organisations and global agreements on certain things, in my opinion, they shouldn't be at the expense of national markers of identity. And I think, as was touched upon earlier, when people talk about nationalism, they don't think of, you know, nationalism in the sense of a common belief or common outlook or shared political values. They very much view it in the sense of ethno-nationalisms, and that brings up images of, you know, EDL and Tommy Robinson, etc., toxic brands. So get back to your question, in its broader sense, I think young people feel sovereignty is a tool that isn't needed in a globalised world. But as we're seeing with, you know, populist parties growing in Europe, there's going to be a backlash to that. So again, it's just, you know, making sure people are informed and actually realise the importance of sovereignty. And sovereignty isn't a, you know, isolationist stance. It's just a right that should be enjoyed by every free democratic state.
Following on from that, I think sovereignty, I think it's viewed as an old-fashioned concept. I think sovereignty, like you were saying, equals nationalism, anger, and this view from, and particularly when we're talking about the left of it, the left side of the political debate. I mean, the Labour Strategy Committee in the mid-80s came out very clearly in a cabinet paper saying, the concept of, Euroscepticism is purely on the left from the loony left. That's what they viewed it as. That's, a direct quote from their thing. So their view of the left of centre, of concepts such as sovereignty, democracy, anything like that, they don't view that as a hindrance, which early left-wing Eurosceptics viewed it as. What we need to move away from is, sovereignty is important, but we need to explain to people why sovereignty is important, not purely as this sort of abstract concept, but to say to somebody, you are left-wing, therefore, you're a communist, you're a socialist, whatever you want to call yourself. If you believe in X, Y, Z, like, you're against or supportive of state aid, you want more control over your economy, whatever your view is, to get that, one must be sovereign. And I think that connection is missed. And I think when we put out concepts like sovereignty, freedom, democracy, people say, sound bites, but they can't bridge the gap between that and their own political desires. And I think that's really important for us to communicate better.
If it was just a return of self-government, and that message was put out so that whenever people talked about sovereignty, you say, yes, that's self-government.
But people are very happy to be, I agree with you, people are very happy to be supportive and, hand in hand with people like Emmanuel Macron in the EU, and they say, that's the way of making sure that those far-right lunatics like Nigel Farage don't come into power. But actually, when you say things like, well, Marine Le Pen was very close to getting elected in France, and she would then be one of the biggest voices in making laws that would affect us, you and me. What are your views on that? Oh, it's nothing to do with us. Well, we've got to make clear that this is, Hungary, Marine Le Pen, this is not some socialist paradise. And I think we've got to make that clear to, when we talk about young people who are predominantly on the left wing, we've got to make clear that the EU is not a socialist paradise. It's far from it.
Gentleman at the back in the check shirt.
One of the things I tend to find is if you can baffle some young people by pointing out that Europe's a wider concept than the EU. So if you talk about St. Petersburg, Belgrade, Kiev, Geneva, all these great historical cities, nations, cultures that you're interested in, etc. And also the older and wider and deeper Europe, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Tolstoy. Again, you're interested in that, not the old failed politicians coming from nation states to the common and democratic political institutions in the EU. And when you throw that at them, it's not obvious that they've got an answer to what that is. Another point to make is, I often say to them, is what can you do that a Norwegian and Swiss young person can't do? Both countries having voted no to the EU twice. So it's a very strange state of affairs. And another thing I always try to point out, does seem that EU nationalism is on the march, demanding more powers from nation states, ignoring national electorates in every country, flag waving, bollocks to Brexit, anthems standing for it. It wants all the features of a nation state that we currently are at a level above that without a common identity, and that's the problem. EU nationalism is a problem.
That's a very good point, actually. Jared, did you want to...
Yeah, I'll say something brief. I'm conscious I don't want to be talking for the whole panel. You're completely right. Often Europe and the EU used synonymously, and you sort of would seem to forget that Europe constitutes more than 28 countries, and what it means to be European isn't necessarily what is shared by the EU. And I think communicating that message is key. You can be a European, but a Brexiteer. And I think trying to communicate that effectively is part of the challenge. But also, in the UK, we tend to view the European Union very much through an economic lens and sort of forget its political underpinnings by virtue of the fact we're slightly on the island, we're not a part of the euro. And I think for young people, they're unaware of a lot of the political difficulties that their cohorts would have in mainland Europe just because we're slightly divorced from it.
I wonder if David could come in on this, actually, because, talking about sovereignty and it being a dirty word, but one of the trappings of sovereignty is having an army. And if we're heading towards an EU army, are we just looking at a new form of nationalism, but it's at the European level?
Yeah, certainly do see that a lot of the wording around the agreements and the political debate around the EU's militarisation is quite nationalistic. It's they even use the phrase decision-making autonomy, the sovereignty of Europe, and ensuring that every structure they create underpins that. I do think that what we're going through is a kind of a battle of sovereignties. You have the Remainers who believe in a European sovereignty or an EU sovereignty versus those who believe in a national sovereignty. And I think the EU identified very early on that academia needed to be its principal battleground for doing that. It was going to mobilize the intelligentsia to take its arguments forward and fund them. And by funding them, they create this selection bias, which we heard before. And I think one of the advantages of being out when or if we do get out is that that funding stream should stop, and we need to ensure that it does. I mean, I'm talking about funding streams like the Jean Monnet professors, the people who are the evangelists of the EU project within universities. I'm not talking about the collaborative science funding, which even now exists beyond the EU to about 16 other countries. Once that sort of that umbilical support is severed, then the evangelists of the EU project should be it should be possible for us to tackle them and to push back. But this battle of sovereignties, you know, what kind of polity, what grouping do the individual citizens and students in university believe in? Is it UK or EU? That's going to go on for years and years. So I think at the 100th anniversary, potentially, of the CIB, we'll be in a better place, but we'll still be fighting it.
Lady in the middle.
Hello. I've just got 2 points to make. First of all, to Laura, I'm very glad to see somebody from Labour Leave here. If I hear Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, speaking, he believes that you can reform the EU from within. So I think there's an argument to be had on the left, well, the centre and on the right, whether or not the EU can be reformed. But I think there's quite a few people that voted Remain because they felt they could have a socialist EU. So I think that's an argument to be had. The other thing, the other point I'd like to make to you, Ben, is that 20-25% of people that support the Green Party voted Leave. When I was campaigning to leave the European Union, I ended up on a vote Leave EU stand, and I didn't like some of the literature. Thankfully, I came across Green Leaves, which were people who are members of the Green Party who voted to leave on many different issues, including sovereignty. I'm not a member of any party. And I think that if I would never join your organisation, because I would feel that it would be just very right-wing people, in my opinion, and I wouldn't feel comfortable that if I brought up climate change, whatever the reasons for that climate changing, it is changing. I can just see by the number of bees that have left my garden over the last 3 years. So I feel that if you want to have a successful organisation for Leavers, you need to make people feel, whatever spectrum they were on the Leave vote, that they would be welcome to have a debate, that they would be respected and they would be listened to. Hundreds of thousands of young people are really into Extinction Rebellion. It's a huge movement. And people need to think about why it is that those people are engaged in that. So I think, you know, those are just points that I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Let's come to Ben first.
Can I just come back on that? I think you misunderstood me because that was my whole argument. I hope I didn't come across and give the opposite intention. I didn't. So my whole argument was that, for example, things like climate change, where I said people in this room might, typically as a Eurosceptic, roll their eyes at, they need to be addressed. So what I'm saying is, Leavers of Britain is that network. It's that network that's open to everybody, and it needs to move away from this old school style Kipper, Euroscepticism. That was the crux of my talk, actually. So I'm going to have to watch it on the video to make sure I didn't mix my words up.
So have you found that you've tended to get a range of people from the whole political spectrum, or does it end up being the traditional right?
You do get in Leavers of Dorset, you get a mix, but of course there is always going to be a strong UKIP element, because the people who are most energised about and exercised about the European Union are, either used to be in UKIP or they still are in UKIP. That's just, that's almost a truism. And you have to, it's surprising actually how much motivation it takes and how much effort it takes for somebody to just get them out to come to the pub to have a drink. You know what I mean? To break their schedule and say, right, on Monday I'm going to go to the Leavers of Dorset. So the people who are really exercised about it tend to be these kind of hardline Eurosceptics, and it's just an accident of history that UKIP captured that mindshare, and so we do. But Leavers of Britain is really trying to break that mold.
Okay, Laura, reforming
Yes.
the EU from within.
Well, thank you for your point. I completely agree with you. And actually, I've been with Labour Leave since September, but I've been around them for years. And actually, every event I've been to, whoever you're on a panel with and whoever's speaking, I'm often with Brendan Chilton, and the swathes of people who come up to him at the end and say, thank you for finally putting a view forward that represents me, rather than just a Nigel Farage view. So I do think it's really important, like you were saying, to represent far more than merely one sector of the Brexit vote, because it might take 25%, 30% of the vote and get them on board, but what about the rest of them? We have to get a majority on our side, and we have to bring people together rather than putting forward divisive views that we might have. In regards to reforming from within, I have, that was a view that particularly came up in the 80s in the Labour Party, people discussing, Roy Jenkins of the world, wanting to say, hey, let's get in the EU, we can only have a voice when we're in it. I mean, I think it's becoming more and more clear, and if we look at the history of the EU, that is clearly impossible, and there is no way, in my opinion, or I don't think anyone in this room, that there is a way of reforming the EU to a way that we would be supportive of, most of all to do with the fact that we don't have control within the EU, and democracy is just seeped away in people like, the Commissioner and, the European Parliament has almost no control. So I think if you even just look at the structures of the EU, it's pretty clear that reforming from within is almost impossible. And I think it's actually getting worse as we've been in there. So unfortunately, I don't think but I do think that's an argument that we should put forward and highlight. And actually, if any young people say that to me, I say, well, David Cameron did go forward and try and reform. I mean, we can all think it's a pathetic attempt, but at the end of the day, he went over there and he said, I need X, Y, Z to get people on board. And they went, yeah, no thanks. There was no desire to reform. It's the complete opposite. In the EU, they want further integration. They want an EU army. They want a superstate. And they're very open about that. And fair enough. I have respect for people to come out and just say it. Guy Verhofstadt, he wants a European superstate. So that's the direction they're going. And if people think that it's actually going to go into some looser form of federation of different states just working together on trade, then they'd be fools. That's what I'd say.
Laura, do you think that young people in Labour, do they recognise the problems within the EU but think they can be reformed from within? Or is it more that they just don't recognise the problems with the EU and they think it's wonderful?
No, I think a lot of people do recognise the problems with the EU, but I think what their view is like what's been discussed a lot, is that their view of Brexit and anyone who could, mention the idea of withdrawal are all the Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they can't see themselves as that. And actually, sadly, for all of us, whether we're young or old, we often associate views by looking at somebody going, I can see myself in them, I can see my views in that person. And that's why when somebody like Brendan Chilton or Kate Hoey or John Mills stands on a platform and puts their views forward, so people flock to them and say, actually, I have views like yours. I'm not a far-right, Tommy Robinson, and I agree with you. And it actually, but there aren't enough of us, and there aren't enough people putting that forward. And sadly, I think that's our biggest problem. But they do want reform. I don't think they think it's perfect, but I just think they'd rather do it inside rather than out.
Okay, the lady at the front in the red cardigan. Thank you.
I'm very interested because we had teams working during the referendum, and they were composed of people from about 17 right up to over 60. This was in inner London. They were... Sorry?
Is this in the Vote Leave headquarters?
This was on the ground in the campaign in inner London. A number of boroughs, 8 constituencies. We had a cross-section of people, activists, some from very experienced Conservative campaigners, Labour campaigners, people from the Liberal Party. The one thing we didn't have was actually, we didn't have any UKIPers. We had people from the Communist Party and from the Green Party. And we also carefully selected, knowing the sort of areas we were dealing with, we used material, and I have to say, thank you very much, Vote Labour Leave. It was excellent material, and we made a point of distributing Labour Leave material, partly because it was giving the facts, partly because it was pointing out that if you want to renationalise any industries, you can't do it if you're in the EU. And also because we knew what our target audience was, and we knew they were not likely to look at anything else. I think we need to be much better at targeting. That, for example, where you know you're dealing with a predominantly left audience, it's no good going in with generic stuff that's covered with lots of blue and which is designed actually to appeal to Tories in the shires. You need to target. And I think, bearing in mind what people have been saying here about targeting young people, given that they are of the left, you know, we all recognise that when you're young, you're on the left. I think we should be much more presenting them with the left arguments. Even if that's not, some people will know, I had the greatest difficulty, you can imagine, persuading people who'd always gone out delivering Tory material that they were now to deliver Labour.
Okay,
but I think we need to be more flexible. I think we need to take on board what the people have been saying here and be more flexible with the sort of material we produce, which is targeted on the audience whom we need to persuade.
Okay, so the questions about targeting, obviously this is sometimes easier said than done. I think we all recognise the need for it. But just very quickly, as this is the last question we've got time for, how do we do that? How do we get to our target audience and make sure that young people in particular and those on the left feel included in Brexit? So I'll come to the panel in order. So David, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks. I think targeting has to be really thought through, and it has to be strategic. And you raised an excellent point, because sending Labour Leave material out to, it might have been a predominantly Labour area anyway, it's going to usurp and turn upside down all of people's perceptions towards what a Leave vote really is. And that would work on Tories and everybody else. And that's a brilliant strategic exercise. I think Vote Leave also did something similar with their branding, and that's why they chose red, because they knew that it would carry very well in non-conservative areas that they thought might be on their side already. Yeah, that's. I think I've said it.
Okay, Jared, how did you do this? Because obviously you were active in Cambridge, which is not a particularly Brexity area. So how did you?
No, I think that was probably an understatement. I think Cambridge was trying to convert those people was very difficult. In order for targeting to be effective, you need to sort of just have a very unified sort of campaign, sort of grassroots. And as Ben alluded to, where the Leave side is very much struggling is that it's not as organised. as its opponent in the Remain campaign. And I'd argue there's potentially too many faction groups within the Leave community, which sort of makes it harder to find a uniform vote. And looking towards the European elections, I just hope that you don't have too many splinter, Eurosceptic parties, so then the vote is split over the course of them. So back to your original question, targeting has to be effective if you're all agreed on a common goal. And so I think there just needs to be some uniformity for those campaign on the ground.
Thank you. So, Laura, you can probably give quite practical examples of what they believe.
Yes, I mean, I would say, probably not very popular, but I would say that most of the Leave organisations I've ever come across, or actually the whole Leave side, has been utterly ineffective in this, to put it mildly. I think the problem is that if our ideal, which we've discussed so many times, is changing the brand, all we've done is reinforce the brand. And I think there needs to be, I mean, it's probably not very popular, but I think there needs to be a total rethink of how we do it. And I think the notion that we continue peddling the same arguments and not realise that, people aren't responding to the same sound bites, that's our fault. And we should take that on our shoulders and stop blaming everyone else. It's our fault that the message isn't getting through. The Remain campaign might have a lot more money, might be a lot better organised, but they're better organised because they chose to be. We didn't choose to be. We chose to be splintered, and we chose to put far too much time and money into organisations which, peddle a right-wing side of it. We arguably have the Tories. The Tory Brexiteers, we have them on board. It's not them we have to persuade. It's, the people on the left, the young people, all these groups that we keep talking about. We can go over and over and, preach to the converted, but unless we actually try and branch out and put forward arguments that, might resonate with groups other than ourselves, we're never going to go beyond that. So, sorry for being a Debbie Downer, but that's my view.
I guess I just very briefly say yes. You need to target, and you need to do it on good information, and that takes organisation, which brings us around to the beginning of the discussion. So it's a difficult problem, and if you, in the absence of sufficient data, perhaps staying non-partisan might be the safest option, because there are good reasons that can be constructed for leaving the European Union, very good reasons that are completely outside and separate from left-right politics.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much. Firstly, to the audience, there were some brilliant questions there which really enabled our members of the panel to put some really interesting points and where the Brexit movement needs to go in the future, in particular with regards to engaging younger generations. And thank you very much to all the members of our panel for giving up their time to be here with us today.